Anxiety disorders. Today, guys, we're going to talk about panic disorders. We'll talk about phobias. We'll also talk about generalized anxiety disorder and some acronyms like OCD and PTSD. It's going to be great. Let's get into it here. Anxiety disorders. So our working definition is going to be that they are characterized by intense and persistent. Those two things are key. Intense and persistent uneasiness, fear, worry, all that cause dysfunctional behavior. If you think about last time, we talked about some of the criteria for what a mental disorder consists of. And one of those is dysfunctional behavior, meaning like you can't do the things you want to do. You can't go to practice, you can't go to work, you can't go to school because of some mental issue that's going on. Now, anxiety disorders can be broken down into a couple different things: trauma, compulsion, and fear. So first off, the DSM-5, they list 12 specific anxiety disorders. The most prevalent one is going to be generalized anxiety disorder. We'll talk about that first. Then we'll go into panic disorders and phobias. Now, some anxiety disorders have been reclassified. So for example, OCD used to be under an anxiety disorder, but now it's under obsessive-compulsive and related disorders. Just like PTSD used to be anxiety disorder, now it's under trauma and stressor related. So generalized anxiety disorder, think of this as low level but long-term anxiety. So it's chronic and prolonged. It's low levels of anxiety, and we're talking 6 months or more for our time frame. Not really associated with a specific situation or object, but this kind of overarching anxiety that encompasses somebody. People are unable to stop that constant dread. Again, it's going to be disrupting your life. Arouses the autonomic nervous system. So think fight or flight. What are the things that our fight or flight system does? Raises our heart rate, raises our blood pressure, increases our breathing. So if we're hiking in the woods and a bear jumps out, we are going to go into that fight or flight mode. All these things are going to happen to us physiologically so that we can run out of there or we can fight for our lives. Right? We get that adrenaline, that noradrenaline, and that cortisol is released with the autonomic nervous system, which is good for short term, but really hard on us for long term. So these bouts of anxiety can last for a few minutes or up to hours on end. And some of the symptoms: trouble sleeping, difficulty concentrating, being irritable and feeling tense. And you know, if you've been anxious the night before a big test or a big sports competition or performance, you're going to have trouble concentrating or sleeping, being irritable, or being tense because of that anxiety. But with generalized anxiety, that's kind of happening all the time. All right, panic disorder. This is just the opposite of generalized anxiety disorder. Think like short-term and very, very intense. So we have intense repeating attacks of an acute anxiety without any apparent prompting. So same idea. Nothing really specific is prompting this panic attack, but it's just this overwhelming anxiety. These often increase in frequency, causing additional anxiety, anticipating future attacks, right? It's a vicious cycle. You have a panic attack, and then you might have more panic attacks because you're anticipating having a panic attack. So it's very bad. Psychological symptoms: fear that something terrible is going to happen at any minute. Again, not really a specific thing, but just this overarching dread. Physiologically, it's that autonomic nervous system again, right? Sweating, could be elevated heart rate, dizziness, chest pain, feels like the walls are kind of closing in around you. These are really statistically rare. So if you have 3 or more attacks over a 6-month period, that would be cause for alarm. So they're not that often. Phobias, these are intense and irrational fears of objects, activities, or situations. So again, the two key words there: intense and irrational, and they cause avoidant behavior. So this disrupts daily lives. So for example, if I'm scared of snakes, I'm very scared of snakes. Avoidant behavior might look like me not going to the city because there's a zoo there. Not me not going to the snake exhibit at the zoo or the zoo itself. Me not going to the city because there's a zoo there and there's snakes in the zoo. That's kind of the avoidant behavior we're talking about. Nearly 5% of people suffer from at least some mild form of phobias. Social anxiety disorder is one of them. Fearing embarrassment in public places is a very common one. Used to be called social phobia, now reclassified as social anxiety disorder. Some other phobias you're probably familiar with: agoraphobia. I'd write that one down. Agoraphobia, fear of open places. Now, we're not talking like Kansas here. We're talking like leaving your home. So open as in outside of your area of comfort. So your comfort, you're secure in your home, but leaving your home to an open space is going to be very anxiety driving. Arachnophobia, spiders. Oh, aerophobia, flying in an airplane. That might be a combination of claustrophobia as well, enclosed spaces. And then zoophobia, animals could be snakes, mice, rats, cats, dogs. Who's scared of cats? Kittens are the best. Moving on to obsessive-compulsive disorder. I'm sure you've heard of this, OCD. The key here is the obsessive. So let's dive into that a little bit. It's persistent, intrusive, unwanted thoughts, and those cause someone to feel the need to engage in a particular action. Obsessions are the repeating thoughts. This is the driving force of OCD. Compulsions then are the behaviors, and those behaviors are to give somebody relief from those obsessions. So look at this chart here, which my face is in the way of. I'm sorry. It starts with obsessive thoughts. So these are like thoughts that are almost outside of yourself, something terrible and awful that you think about and you can't stop thinking about, where it almost feels like somebody else is bringing those thoughts onto you. To stop those, you engage in these compulsive behaviors. So those obsessive thoughts, down here it says increased anxiety. That increased anxiety leads to those behaviors that try and reduce that anxiety, giving you temporary relief. But then, of course, the obsessive thoughts keep coming back, so you keep doing these compulsive behaviors. Let me give you some examples. So some subcategories include hoarding, contamination, obsessions with cleaning, compulsions. So for example, if you have these obsessive thoughts about germs and getting sick, the way that you are going to lessen that anxiety from those thoughts is by washing your hands over and over and over again. Same idea with hoarding or any of these ones. There's obsessions without visual compulsions, harm obsessions with checking compulsions, symmetry obsessions with orderly compulsions. So think about this. If you have these obsessive thoughts about symmetry and the picture frame is not quite perfectly centered, you're going to be thinking about that. And your compulsion would be go back and check it and fix it. And then you're thinking about it and you go back and check it and fix it again. So it's over and over and over. These compulsions are relieving the anxiety from the obsessive thoughts. All right, living with OCD. This is a great little video clip I want to show. This is John Green, and he has OCD, and I love how he kind of gives his personal experiences with it, how he explains his experience with compulsions, but then he also talks about the idea of how mental illness can be romanticized, which I think is really interesting. We know it could be stigmatized, but how can it be romanticized? Let's check this out real quick.
Good morning, Hank. It's Tuesday. This video is about my mental health, but I want to say here at the outset that I am not a psychologist, and that in general, I think we should listen to experts when it comes to mental health and also when it comes to other things. But I can only speak to my personal experience. Okay, so it seems to me that the stuff happening way down inside of us is difficult to talk about, partly because those experiences aren't really accessible by the senses. You can't usually see or hear psychic pain, and it's difficult to describe without simile or metaphor. Like, I might say that it feels like there's a void inside of me, or like my insides are twisted, or like my brain is on fire. I can say what it's like more than I can say what it is. So I have obsessive-compulsive disorder, which is mostly seen in the popular imagination as being about like excessive hand washing or neatness or whatever, because those are things you can see, you know? They're not like the formless, insensate horrors of psychic pain. They're behaviors that you can like portray in a movie. But for me at least, there's a reason the obsessive comes before the compulsive in the name. So I experience these obsessive thought spirals in which intrusive thoughts, that is, like thoughts that I don't want to have that seem to come from outside of me, sort of hijack my consciousness. Now, everyone has known some version of not being able to choose their thoughts. Like, after you lose someone, you may find yourself thinking about them all the time. You may see a sunset and think about seeing a sunset with that person, or you open a car door and remember driving with them, etc. But for me, these obsessive thought spirals happen all the time, and they can take over for days or weeks or months. Like, I might worry out of nowhere that my food is contaminated or somehow poisoned, and then suddenly that will be the only thought I'm able to think, the thought I'm either thinking or distracting myself from all the time. And when that gets bad, I can lose all control over my thoughts for an extended period of time, to the extent that I can't follow what's happening in a TV show or read a book. This is exhausting, of course, but it's also kind of terrifying because, one, I can't stop being scared of the thing I'm scared about. And two, if I can't choose my thoughts, and I am at least in part made out of those thoughts, then am I actually the captain of this ship I call myself? And the more you think about that, at least for me, the more it becomes sort of the premise for a horror movie. Right, so the compulsive behaviors I use to cope with these obsessive thought spirals, repeatedly checking my food for contamination, for instance, or spending hours Googling what will happen to me if I eat moldy bread, those are for me ways of trying to comfort and calm myself. Like, I'm not checking over and over again to be eccentric or whatever, I'm doing it because I cannot stop obsessing over the fear that I might have eaten living mold, and I will do whatever I can not to be strangled by that thought. Mental illness is highly stigmatized in our culture, but it is also sometimes romanticized. We see TV shows where in order to catch a terrorist, a mentally ill person must go off their meds, or we see obsessive detectives whose obsessiveness allows them to crack cases that others couldn't. That kind of thing might be true to some people's experiences, but it hasn't been true to mine. Like, I don't feel like my mental illness has any superpower side effects. In fact, when I'm stuck inside a thought spiral, I find it very difficult to observe, like, anything outside of myself. I become a terrible detective.
All right, good stuff. Last slide here, PTSD, post-traumatic stress. This is a trauma and stress-related disorder resulting from exposure to extremely troubling events. This can be things like war, but it can be other things too. It can be a violent crime. It can be an intense car crash, a natural disaster, any kind of really intense traumatic event somebody goes through. The greater the trauma, the higher the risk for this disorder. This often involves flashbacks, could involve nightmares, and then victims often experience difficulty concentrating because of all that stress, hyper alertness, self-blame, and then maybe guilt. All right, guys, we did it. We did it. That was fast. That was so fast. Good stuff. Review time, couple review questions. Let's get after it. Which is the best example of someone experiencing obsessive-compulsive disorder? Complaining constantly to different doctors about feeling sick, hyperventilating in an elevator, returning home several times a day to see if the stove is off, wandering around town in a daze, or hearing voices in a quiet room. What do we got down there? What do we got down there? I don't know. A chimney, a cabin. Nope. It's a cottage. C, OCD, returning home several times a day to see if the stove. That's the compulsions that we're seeing there. Let me move my face. Zoom. That was fast. All right. This disorder is characterized by irritability, difficulty concentrating, and inability to control one's worry. Ooh, that last part should help you here. Phobias, generalized anxiety, obsessive-compulsive, bipolar, or hypochondria. What do you think here in the picture? It's really tricky. It's this thing right there. That's a beaver dam, my friends. B for beaver dam, generalized anxiety disorder. Last one. Here we go. Barbara was on the bus when she suddenly felt overwhelmed. Her heart started racing. Her legs began to feel weak and her body trembled. She thought she was losing her mind. Barbara's symptoms indicate she has what? Bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, or panic disorder. What do you think it's going to be? What about the picture? What's that guy doing? Is what I'm going to be doing here in a minute. Editing videos. It's kind of fun. I really like it. I'm not very good, but it's good. All right, you made it. Oh, look at my face. All right, you did it, guys. Give me a quick one sentence, maybe a 20-word summary over these notes. Great time to review your notes real fast. It's going to help sink in that information. You are the best. Have a fantastic day. Happy Mustache March. Time to go. Here we go. I didn't even finish my coffee yet. This is great. Bonus. Check out this picture a student drew of me. Amazing. Mr. Dubois with a mustache. It's the best kind of Dubois. So some subcategory,